This is the presentation for the Master of Engineering report prepared by Ismail Nabhan, advisor Dr. Layth Al-Hadidi. The topic is Framework for Developing Renewable Energy. This paper examines the global energy trends over the past few decades and utilize data analytical methods and qualitative analysis to build an understanding of the factors that impact development in the renewable system, and then evaluate those factors and how they interact with each other within and how they interact with other factors in the energy mix in order to define the share and growth of renewable energy within the energy mix. This gives us a methodology that allows us to evaluate where a given country stands with regard to development of the renewable energy, and then allows us to use that evaluation to develop required strategies to increase development and adaptation of renewable energy within the energy mix for any given country. It's important in the start to understand the rationale behind this paper. So energy availability and sustainability is an integral part and has been and will always be an integral part of the economic, social, and technological advancement of the world. And this has been proven over the last 100 years and will be proven for the next 100 years again. Some of the high-level numbers regarding energy consumption globally. The data shows that the rate of growth have been more than 800% over over a span of 100 years, and over the past 40 years, it has increased by 40% over the last 18 years. This growth is mainly driven by three factors according to the World Bank: rise in the world population, global economic development in terms of global GDP development, an increase, and finally the industry and technological advancement, the advancement that has led to an increase in energy consumption per capita globally. It's important to understand or to highlight why we selected this topic for the paper. So growth in energy demand and consumption will increase and have been increasing as we showed in previously. The search for renewable, sustainable, clean energy have been a major concern across all global forums, scientific and otherwise. There have been a large research recently in the past years and decades around the technologies for the renewable energy and how to improve them, how to improve their transition or their storage, etc. But there have been a limitation of research that clearly define what are the factors that impact the development of renewable energy within a given country, and how those factors can be utilized to develop strategies to increase adoption and development of renewable energy within a given country. The background information that we need to have in order to proceed with our papers to understand the current energy mix and what are the current energy sources that are used globally and how they are, and for the sake of our paper, we segregate them in three categories mainly: fossil fuels driven, solar and wind, which are the focus for our paper, and then other renewables such as nuclear or hydropower, etc. One note to mention here is the reason why we focus solely on solar and wind rather than also including nuclear and other technologies is because of the limitation around those other technologies. For example, hydropower would require to have physical availability of waterfalls, etc., which might not be applicable everywhere around the world, and actually most countries do not enjoy them. So it would make less of a sense to have strategies including those when that actual resource might not available. There are other technologies such as nuclear where there are limitations on how the technology availability and how it can be used, etc., due to the obvious reasons. So this is why we limited our research into solar and wind. At the start of our literature review, we wanted to identify some historical energy transitions as we can take those as a model for what we would consider an energy transition in form of having solar and wind as developed in a higher rate or higher part of the energy mix. So we identified the previous historical energy transition, and they can be summarized as shown in in the presentation. You know, an increase in coal consumption, oil and gas emergence, stability in energy sources, and then the rise of solar and wind. And in summary, when you look at other research that evaluate each of those energy transition, or some of the other or some of the other ways that these energy transition have been categorized, you would see that there are always three kind of categories on high level that are established: economic, economic factors that we looked into the literature to show what kind of economic factors, technology and social ones that have been identified in previous research or in other technical reports or by analytical reports and experts around the globe to as the driver behind those energy transitions, so we can consider them as factor for our proposed energy transition that we want to support, which is solar and wind development. Summarize the methodology we use for the for our research. We wanted to identify how we can evaluate development levels of solar and wind, and then we wanted to identify and evaluate the factors that we believe would impact their development, and then we wanted to summarize the findings based on the analysis of the factors, and finally use this data and information and those findings to develop strategies for a selected case study in order to allow for a higher development and adoption of solar and wind technologies. On high level, we wanted to have a measure or a data point that we can use to compare as a comparison for development rates for solar and wind technologies within the energy mix. We we selected data points. One is the share of solar and wind from the energy from the power mix, and this is you know self-explanatory in terms of why we selected it. The second one was to actually look at the growth of wind and solar on an annual basis. Now, the reason why we wanted to look at both the current share and the growth, because it would allow us to evaluate late adopters, that countries that might have started adoption of those technologies quite recently, but they have higher rate of adoption in terms of annual rate, which if only look at the current part of share of the energy mix would give us a wrong indication. Additionally, we did look at some of the other data points that we did not consider as part of the development factors, but we wanted to keep an eye on, such as share of added capacity, although that would be a bit tricky because in some cases you would have a capacity added or for solar and wind, but the actual overall capacity is decreased because of retiring of old technologies, etc. So that's another data point that we have kept, we evaluated and we kept looking at, but we did not indicate here as one of the development factors or the development measures to use. Additionally, also we looked at the overall electricity growth over year, and so we can keep an eye on to see how is that overall impacting. As mentioned in the slide, the initial list of factors that we considered was more than 100 items. Now, through multiple iterations, the numbers have been reduced, but we still have more around 80 factors that were considered. We will go through some of the examples of it here, but the full list of the factors would require a much longer time to present and discuss, and those are available in the report for the further details. In general, as a start, we started with the same chronological order that we identified later, which is economic, technology, and social factors. From economy factors, the first thing we looked at is the GDP related and GDP per capita, etc. One reason why we looked at that is just to understand there was an assumption in some of the research on overall understanding that richer countries, with higher GDP or higher GDP with capita, would be able to have a higher adoption of renewable energy compared to poorer country. And when looking at our sample, or even data point beyond our sample, as we have a list of more than 60 countries, the data is available again is on the report for further information. You can see that there is no clear relation between countries that are having a higher uh, GDP or higher GDP per capita when compare or in a relation with development of renewable solar and wind in specific. One additional set of data that we looked at, we tried to look at fuel economics with regard to fossil fuels. Now, specifically for fossil fuels, since these are the major, the major competitor with renewable energy and solar and wind specific. So we looked at the major fossil fuels, which are coal, oil and gas, and we looked at some economic factors related to them, such are, you know, overall share of electricity mix, share of growth of consumption, production, and etc., just to get an understanding if there is a clear relation between those and how they do impact the utilization and growth of solar and wind. One additional data point that we wanted to look at is fuel subsidies and overall electricity subsidies and energy subsidies. Now, unfortunately, there is not very clear data around it for every country in our sample and even globally. There are certain challenges specifically around subsidies that are highlighted in detail in the report, but in summary, how do you calculate subsidies first of all? Would you consider them around production of those fossil fuels, consumption? Do you consider them direct subsidies or tax breaks, returns, etc.? And not to mention that actually there are limited data around published by governments around actual subsidies. So these are some of the estimation that I'm showing here, and some of it are published government data. But in general, this is a topic that you would find limitation in terms of research or actual data availability for it. And further data would be very helpful in this topic. Of course, one of the essential economic data that points that we looked at is around levelized cost of energy. The details of how to calculate levelized cost of energy and how it needs to be adjusted for certain parts to be looked at into renewable and sources is highlighted in the report. Here as we said, since our focus is solar and wind, we do have the high level understanding of solar and wind overall levelized cost of energy performance globally and for our selected sample. Some of the technology factors that we looked at around here is actually availability of these natural resources that would enable the use of these technologies within the selected sample countries. And the data of it here is summarized here. And the technology factors that we looked at is around electrification levels, transmission and distribution systems, generation, retail systems, etc. And just to highlight the difference between the systems between our selected sample. So we looked at social data that as highlighted in the third category. Some of the items we looked at from social data is around overall population growth, electricity consumption per capita, education level of population, etc. We looked at electricity prices on household level and also commercial price for electricity, energy intensity, as per energy intensity per person, and change, etc. Page, we highlight some of the major findings that we looked at. Now, as mentioned, we only went through a sample of the factors that we looked at through here in the presentation. And actually, for each factor, our findings and our, what kind of understanding we have out of those, and even how we did evaluate further for data points that, pose question for the further question around how they impacted developments or they did not versus we took that whenever we had sufficient data versus a larger population. And as I mentioned, for many of those factors, we managed to get data for 60 countries, but unfortunately, it was not complete to have this exact analysis of all these factors for all the countries. So that Detailed analysis is available in the report. Here we just want to summarize some of the major findings that we find. So overall economic growth does not really drive the adaptation of renewable and solar. It might drive, of course, higher electricity demand and higher power demand and production, but it does not impact how the mix within that power demand, within that power generation increase act. Some of the second one around the levelized cost of energy. So this is definitely an essential part. So you know, attractive levelized cost of energy for these renewable sources have been one a prerequisite for further development. But at the same time, we see countries where the overall levelized cost of energy is very low. Yet again, they haven't been utilized or they have not been reflected into higher growth or development for those technologies. So it is a prerequisite, but it does not mandate the actual growth. Subsidies and their and how they are translated in terms of policy and actual structure do have a significant impact based on the data we've looked at in terms of how they translate and the technology used in the energy mix. Availability of financing was something that we found to be very important, specifically for adoption of renewable energy systems on a smaller scale beyond utility scale, for specifically for households and commercial buildings. Electricity prices, of course, are associated with development rates for solar and wind, so higher electricity rates would drive people to go into a more economical option, which is clear. Or, and finally, institutionalized efforts from policymakers, whether it's in form of strategies or actual policies uh, that can be explained through, for example, the subsidies or overall awareness and support for these systems to play a major role in it and in their development. As highlighted at the start of the report, the purpose of it is to have a framework for developing solar and wind energy as far solar and wind energy. Now, the first step in doing that is actually understanding the factors that impact development of solar and wind within a given country of its energy mix or power mix, and having a standardized way to evaluate them, which we have done so far and we have explained up to this stage of the report. But then an important part is how can we translate those findings, like these understanding and those factors that we evaluated into a standardized way that can be used as a framework or part of that framework into strategy that can be used by countries, decision makers, policy makers, and business leaders to increase the development of those technologies within a given country. And this is what, and this is why when we looked at the potential methods of doing that, we wanted to we find that the balance scorecard method can be used here for that purpose. Said, although we wanted to use the balanced scorecard method for the second part of our framework development, we find some challenges if we wanted to use the standard balanced scorecard method that is found in the literature. So we looked into the literature to see if there are any adaptation or changes of the standard scorecard method into something that is more subtle or usable for energy energy development in general or renewable development in specific. We did find a couple of modification on the original balanced scorecard method, and then based on that we kind of modified them further to meet, to match how we classified our factors and what kind of understanding we gain out of them. Based on how we designed our balanced scorecard, we identified a high level kind of strategy that we wanted to achieve, which is basically to reduce the use of fossil fuels in the power mix, improve environmental quality, meet power demand, increase solar and wind power share of the mix, and then increase solar growth and wind growth annually. Now, these objectives are actually highlighted on how they are interconnected and how they interact with and interconnect with the different level of the balanced scorecard method that we have adopted here. On this page, we see how we translated our version of the balanced scorecard method into actual strategy development, and we see the interconnection between the value reset. So instead of the standard one of customer, internal process, financial, learning and development, we've adapted something that looks at the overall solar and wind development, customer perspective, organizational capacity perspective, learning and development. And for example, we can track how some of the items here interconnect. So reduce of use of oil and gas and power mix is actually, would by default be connected to increase and growth of year over year of solar and wind and share of the power mix. And then we can see that adaptation here can be tracked into different levels, whether it's in the utility scale, power plants, or personal or commercial properties. And then we can see, for example, the relation around levelized cost of energy, improving the technology efficiency and the research capability, but also looking at development of the subsidies for it and the regulations. So looking at the strategy using this model allows us to build it and understand the interconnection of the factors that we have liked before, and also give us a very systematic way of actually using that information into a usable strategy. Study which we used here, which is Saudi Arabia, and how we explained in the previous page around how we used our version of the balanced scorecard method. We can see some of the recommendation or the initiative that would be driven based on that balanced scorecard method. Now, again, the further details of that are available in the report, but this is just some of the initiatives based on that systematic way of developing balanced scorecard. So, for example, having annual plans around the development of an investment in solar and wind, technology subsidy, having specific subsidies for solar and wind technologies, establishing financing programs or building the required human capabilities around it, etc. In conclusion, we want to highlight the unique value of this research, which is basically that it gives you a way that is systematic and can be used across different countries and different geographies, as we proved from our sample, to have a standardized way of evaluating the development of renewable energies and solar and wind in specific, and then how the factors that impact those developments can be evaluated for each given country and can be compared to other countries, and then allow you to take the findings out of that evaluation and translate it into a specific strategy that would serve that country to increase its share of solar and wind within the energy mix. This can, of course, be used for different technologies, and in the same time, if we could have the additional data that would be required, this can be expanded into a larger research in a way that we do the exact same evaluation for a larger sample that could include virtually any country in the world, and based on that, we can categorize where these countries would fall within this using that standard evaluation method, and we can even go further into having specific pre-designed strategies that would match where countries fall within that evaluation. So and this is just some of the potential that can be used based on the strategy. Thank you for taking the time to go over the report and the presentation, and I hope that you give me an A plus and help me on this research